So, this is one of those topics which sounds obvious, but isn't really. And also, I will say this. I can probably take this up to about 1925. And I will say this, once we get into the alternate history, I can take this to about 1925. But I don't think you can take it any further, because you started to change history so much that it's then basically my guesstimates, and things will have changed, a lot of conditions will change. One of the interesting things that will have changed is the nature of a lot of the agreements. Because, honestly, for a lot of nations, and I'm talking not just about Britain, but I'm talking about, to an extent, Germany, to an extent, America, to an extent, even France, although they were really hoping for a large number of ships, Japan and Italy, for all of them, the German High Seas Fleet sinking actually solved problems. It actually reduced tensions. It actually made things easier in some way. And that's a scary piece of history to think about. The thing is, it's the complexity. I don't think you get an immediate war over the High Seas Fleet. I'm just going to rule that out here. If we're going to get into discussing the real history or the alternate history, and it's always real history up till we get to the Shameless book, then it's the alternate history, as I do with all these ones. But I'm going to, because there are sometimes people go, oh, why don't you think there's going to be a war, or this, that, and, because they've just been through World War One. No one really wants another war over a few old ships. It's going to be tension. It's going to force some changes, and I'm going to talk through the extent the things which I'm going to talk about in terms of the history are going to be the things which are going to change most in the alternate history. But yes, this is a fun one to talk about. What if the German High Seas Fleet isn't scuttled in World War One? So, the process had begun when the High Seas Fleet was ordered to surrender. First craft were U-boats. They arrived in Harwich on 20th November 1918. 176 eventually are handed over. Not all are at Scapa Flow. Hipper refused to lead the surface fleet to its surrender. So that went to Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, an honourable officer. An honourable officer. It was met, when it came out, by HMS Cardiff, a C-class light cruiser, on the morning of the 21st November 1918, and was led to the rendezvous, where 370 vessels of the Grand Fleet and other Allied forces that had been brought together for the occasion surrounded them. 70 German vessels. The Koenig and the Dresden, the battleship and the light cruiser, had engine trouble and had to be left behind. The V-30, a destroyer, struck a mine and sunk while crossing. Once they arrived in the Firth of Forth, they were ordered by Beatty to haul down their flags at sunset and not to hoist them again without permission. Then slowly, between the 25th and 27th of November, the fleets moved to Scapa Flow, and the destroyers to a place called Gutter Sound, the battleships and cruisers to the north and west of the island of Caba. Eventually, and I do mean eventually, it takes a while, there are 74 vessels interred there, the ones which are judged to be in the best condition to fight, pretty much. The Koenig and the Dresden arrived in December, accompanied by the destroyer V129, which replaced the V30 as being sent in there. Eventually the Baden would be the last battleship to arrive on the 9th of January 1919. The force which guarded them initially was the battlecruiser fleet. That, of course, then it becomes the battlecruiser squadron, commanded first by Pakenham, that's Vice Admiral Pakenham, then Rear Admiral Oliver, Henry Oliver, and then finally Rear Admiral Roger Keyes. In May 1919, when they realised the point was coming to that it was going to be crucial to be looking after them, Vice Admiral Sir Arthur Leveson and the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Atlantic Fleet were sent to take over guarding duties. And then they were succeeded by Vice Admiral Sir Sidney Fremantle and the 1st Battle Squadron on the 18th of May. The Royal Navy was rotating ships in and out for their own maintenance, but also because they wanted to keep an eye on things without giving a chance for sympathy to be created between the two forces should something need to happen. And well, whilst this was going on, the peace conference rattled on. The French and Italians each wanted roughly a quarter of the ships. The British wanted them destroyed. And the Americans were ambivalent. Beatty and Madden had both had plans put in place to seize the German vessels in case scuttling was attempted, and Keyes and Leveson had actually gone further. They'd recommended the ships be seized anyway and cruise and turn to shore on a place called Nig Island. N-I-G-G, just to clarify what I said in case anyone wants to go on it. Nig Island. But it was felt impolitical and impolite to do so, and untrusting. As time went on, they reduced the crews, they sent transports back to Germany, and finally in June 1919, Reuter was left with only reliable men. He had nobody who was going to cause him trouble. He'd sent home all the troublemakers. All the people who disagreed with him, all the people who could have been a problem were gone. And that worked for him. It worked for him. It wasn't necessarily helpful, but it worked for him. And so he sends out orders on the 19th of June. Paragraph 11 of which stated, "It is my intention to sink the ships only if the enemy should attempt to obtain possession of them without the assent of our government. Should our government agree in peace to terms to the surrender of the ships, then the ships will be handed over to the lasting disgrace of those who have placed us in this position." Now that's, on the face of it, sounds like a perfectly reasonable order. Kind of like Order 66 in Star Wars sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing once you couch it in so many other orders. It really does sound reasonable. It does. But, well, news comes in. They know they are probably going to be in trouble, and there's discussions the British are having over seizing the ships. They decide to postpone the operation to seize the German ships on the 21st of June to the 23rd of June. Because they don't want to interrupt the treaty, but also because, honestly, I have this little suspicion in my mind that whilst no one will have written it down, the Royal Navy would not exactly going to be upset if the Germans scuttled themselves. It's just so many things have to go right for the Germans to be able to easily get away with this, with the British not paying any attention. And I'm sorry, but I just find it a little bit problematic. I can argue that the British were, whilst not assisting them, or even, were being, I want to say even creatively negligent, were being less than, how do I put this, being more trusting than they necessarily needed to be. Were being more laissez-faire than they necessarily needed to be with the German ships. That is my strong feeling. It's almost like they're not going to help the Germans do this, they're not going to encourage it, they're not going to write anything down about it. But if everything is arranged in just a subtle way which makes it easier for the Germans to accomplish, because when you look at all the different instructions they have to go through, and all the different orders which are going around, and the British knew what orders were there. They knew his order instruction. They knew what had gone out. They were controlling what information they were getting as best they could. At 10:00 hours on the 21st of June 1919, Reuter sends out a flag signal ordering the fleet to stand ready. At 11:20 hours, the signal sent to all commanding officers and the leader of the torpedo boats, paragraph 11 of today's date, acknowledge. Chief of the Intern Squadron. The signal's repeated by semaphore and searchlights. Now, whilst there isn't a full Royal Navy squadron there are some destroyers and things around paying attention to people ashore. A lot of signals going around. And immediately the sea cocks and flood valves are open. You know, some of these flood valves were literally on their last edge. They've been greased in every way imaginable to make them kind of slip out as quickly as possible, move as freely as possible. Internal water pipes are smashed. Drain valves on the sewage tanks are opened. Portholes were loosened. Watertight doors and condenser covers left open. And in some ships, they had literally bored holes through the bulkheads, all to allow the water to spread as quickly as it could do once scuttling began. You know, there are reports of the ships, as I said, not just lubricating, but they'd also had rested large hammers being played out beside the valves. And this is so much preparation, so much work. And whilst, yes, it's going on, one of the interesting things is they could do all this, and there are no regular inspections taking place. None at all. Now you might go, well, yes, a regular inspection would have been an insult to the German High Seas Fleet. It could have been, but these are your prisoners. These ships are interned assets. A regular inspection would seem appropriate. And let's be honest, a chief petty officer and a lieutenant commander wandering around the ship, coming aboard every day to check on them, check they've got the food they need, do a quick tour of the spaces to check everyone's hygiene's okay. Maybe you send a doctor with the chief. So it's a doctor who's coming to check on everything, and a logistics officer. There are ways you can do this. There are ways it could have been done without making it too problematic. And then you have the fact that there is apparently no noticeable effect until noon. So they start letting in water at 11:20. It's not noticeable until 40 minutes later, when the Frigate de Grosse starts to list heavily to starboard. Now, considering the water's coming in and the way they're opening the fingers up for the water to come in, they'd have started listing relatively quickly. If you're only noticing once they're heavily listing, there's a lot of a lack of attention. No one's actually watching these ships properly, are they? There are only 3 destroyers, one of which was under repair, and 7 trawlers and a few drifters left by the Royal Navy in Scapa Flow. Fremantle, the admiral in charge, remember, who's taking his ships out for exercise, only started receiving the news of Scuttling at 12:20 hours. Approximately an hour after they'd started it, and 20 minutes after after it had been noticed. And cancelled the exercise at 12:35 hours. Steamed at full speed back to Scapa Flow. With a division of ships, he arrives at 14:30 hours. So we're talking 3 hours, 10 minutes after they started this. In time just to see only a few of the large ships still afloat. He had ordered all craft all ready to try and prevent the German ships sinking or to try and beach them. The Hindenburg, the Flinger class and vessel, and was the last German ship to sink, which sunk at 1700 hours. And only the Baden survives. 15 capital ships were sunk. 5 light cruisers, 32 destroyers, all sunk. 9 German personnel died, and 16 were wounded by guards. Because they were panicking. During that afternoon, 1,774 Germans were picked up and transported by the battleships from first battle squadron to Invergordon. They were treated as prisoners of war for having broken the armistice, and they were destined for the prisoner of war camps at Nig. Reuter and his officers were brought onto the quarterdeck of HMS Revenge, where Fremantle, through an interpreter, denounced their actions in the strongest words possible, reprimanding them with a full throatedness. And of course, this was all done also in front of observers from other Allied forces who were part of his staff and all sorts of people. So it gets back to the British were really annoyed about this. They had expressionless faces. Privately, it's well known that Fremantle remarked, "I could not resist feeling some sympathy for Reuter, who had preserved his dignity when placed against his will in a highly unpleasant and invidious position." Now this causes trouble, of course it does. But it also makes things easier. It makes things easier for the Allies when it comes to the fact that, as far as the British were concerned, they wanted peace, and they wanted German naval forces and German naval infrastructure off the board. That's what they wanted. They wanted it off the board. And they did. They got it off the board. They had successfully made it so. And that is helpful, realistically. That is helpful. But, and I do mean this in the strongest way of the Glutamus Maximus, it's not just them who it made life easier for when it came to the peace treaty. You see, it meant instead of having to concede other things for getting ships, you could get peace in different ways. Realistically, this is the beginning, the end of the American involvement in the peace process, because the one thing that really kept them in was the desire to make sure the naval forces weren't spread around. That's too much technology, it's too much capability. For the Italians and the French, there's the loss of ships, which is annoying. Which is really, really annoying, because they'd been counting on those ships. One of the reasons why the Italians had paused their Caracciolos, and one of the reasons why the French had been so slow, because they thought they were going to get some battleships for free, basically. There was a debate over who was going to get what. But there's an honest chance that, realistically, 16 capital ships, 8 cruisers, and 50 destroyers. They're not going to make a massive change to the world's force capability, but if you spread them around amongst the major allied powers who are left, that's going to be an interesting position. The French wanted at least 4 capital ships. The British would probably have wanted 4 as well, but which 4 they'd have wanted 4 and which 4 the Americans wanted is a different matter. For the British, getting Baden and Bayern off the deal for everyone else was important. They would get rid of them very quickly afterwards. They don't fit their fleet plan, but they don't want anyone else getting them because they do represent the best of what the Germans could build. They're about equivalent to an R-class, but they are the best the Germans could build. But there again, they also have battle cruisers. And that's a threat they don't want to spread around. So the peace treaty comes in, and the Treaty of Versailles, well, it's what it is. It's not a great treaty, but it's a treaty which is designed by the victors. Designed by the victors, horrified by a war, and needing to exact some sort of vengeance. And honestly, whilst it's easy at this range from it to go, you should have been the bigger people, you can understand it. You can understand it. You can understand what drove them. But the big thing about the Treaty of Versailles, the big problem with it, of course, it sets up also the League of Nations, but America refuses to join. America refuses to join. And America starts causing trouble almost immediately. Now, the thing is, would they have still been able to cause trouble if the High Seas Fleet was going to spare, going for people to buy? Was it available? Because suddenly that becomes a bounty they want. And the question is, if they don't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, if they hold off ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, that's going to create problems for them with getting hold of the ships. It's one thing, agreeing your own separate treaty, and not join the League of Nations, when no one's dividing up what was one of the world's largest fleets. It's another when you are. And the thing is, the Americans might go down the same route. In the alternate history, I will be talking this through about the various options. But the thing is, that's going to create more problems for them. You see, the real issue for America when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles, etc., is Wilson's 14 points and Wilson's later stroke. Which means his presidency is basically pushed by his wife and his doctor. And that's not a good scenario. He's not a great man. He's not a great president. He really isn't. But he does set out trying to achieve some things. And the Republican Congress, which gets elected in 1920, combined with later Warren G. Harding, the president who follows on from him, really does do a number on American diplomatic capabilities. One of the interesting things is, realistically, their biggest goal they could have achieved was the Washington Naval Treaty, and they get that largely riding on the cooperation brought on from World War I, which they had already caused significant trouble of over the Treaty of Versailles and their abandonment of it, in terms of agreeing a separate US-German peace deal. This they still managed to get through. But that's before you have the allocation of the High Seas Fleet. Because, you see, it's not the value of these ships in actuality which matters. It really sodding doesn't, excuse the French. It doesn't matter. The actual value of these ships is negligible. For powers like Britain and America and even Japan, who are building first-rank battleships, and in large numbers, and then we've got Italy as well, which also fits in that category. This really doesn't matter. These ships really aren't as good for them as the ones they're building themselves. What matters, though, is the visibility of the capability. It's the sudden increase in numbers without having to do anything. It's not the maintenance and the logistics issues and all the operational issues that integrating ships which are built by another navy, using another technological stream for their own purposes and for their own objectives, integrating that into your force. No, that doesn't matter. What matters is the politics of it, the number increase, the status. What matters is the difference in terms of capabilities. It suddenly gives you ships which are expendable because they're not ships you built yourself, they're ships you acquired. It suddenly gives you extra numbers and extra strength. You've suddenly got another battle division, another division of battleships, or you've got battle cruisers. You know, these are things which mean nothing to larger navies, but to the smaller navies, they give them status. They give them power. And that's a problem. That is a real problem. There's also the fact it's going to be the technological spread. Without all this, you know, you can have a separate US-German peace treaty, you can have all those things, you can get it through, and they do. And realistically, why are the Americans getting it? Well, there are some various people who put high, noble ideals on it, but realistically, it comes down to almost partisan politics. Wilson had pushed through various things over Republicans in Congress when the Democrats had controlled it. Now the Republicans controlled it, they wanted to hold it up, and when you add in the fact that Wilson's illness, Wilson's weakness, they want to play games till the Republican gets in, and then the Republican can get the credit for it. And that's it, because look at it realistically. These three gentlemen, and believe it or not, this is a cartoon from America at the time. A lovely cartoon. Boram, Lodge, and Johnson, who didn't really want to give peace a chance. That's the idea, but realistically they didn't want to give peace on a Democrat's terms a chance. They wanted peace on a Republican's terms. They wanted a peace which reflected the interests they supported. Politics. It's a terrible game, but it has to be played because it's the only way the sausage gets made. And that leads us to the Washington Naval Treaty, where powers could agree on this. Where they could basically agree to freeze the world as is for a bit. For a time. Make it peaceful. They could try and prevent what some viewed as a risk for another potential war, but most did not. Most sensible people didn't view it as a risk for another potential war. There was a qualitative race going on, not a quantitative race. And qualitative races never have the same heat in them as quantitative races. They just don't. Qualitative races are about status. Quantitative races are about ability to wage war. That's the reality. Qualitative races are about having an edge. Quantitative races are about victory. The Washington Naval Treaty tries to bring all this together. It tries to bring all the powers together in a way which allows them to work and no longer to spend money on other things, realistically, because that's what the politicians want to do. They want to spend money on other things. Even though it doesn't cost much, even though it ripples through their economy because all the money spent internally and all those things, doesn't matter. They want to spend money on other things. And this is one of the interesting things you get with history. Spending money internally by governments. What do they want to spend money on? Well, if you think about it, house building is a very useful thing to spend money on, social housing, but that doesn't create much throughput in the economy. Let me explain why. You see, once you've built a house, what can they go and do? Build another house? They can't use the land again. There's a house on it. They have to go somewhere else to build something else. You build a ship in a shipyard. That's a warship. That employs that yard for a bit, and it gives them time and money to go get more ships built in that same yard. So you can keep economic productivity going, whether your supplier are ordering warships or not. You can't do that with house building. House building is good for the economy. Trust me, house building is useful for the economy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. I'm saying these different... If you was to take money from one area to spend it on another, it's not going to deliver the same throughput into the economy. There's also the fact that the tech that goes into house building versus the tech that goes into shipbuilding has further ripples. Shipbuilding technology and the technology of other ships on this point ripple through things like power station construction, through all sorts of different areas of plumbing and electronics and mechanics and technology, and ripple into other areas of the economy. Again, house building doesn't. So you might go, well, the government's shifting their money from spending it on building warships and building this technology to building houses. And that's fine. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying it doesn't have the same effects on the economy, the second and third and fourth order effects. And this is the trouble with governments. Even to this day, they often think about the initial transaction and its impact on the economy, not on the subsequent transactions that can come off from that initial transaction, not what can come second, third and fourth order effects. The Naval Treaty is all about saving money on shipbuilding so they can put it on other things, to build lands fit for heroes. Various nations have those different variations of those plans. And they're all interested in it. But still, it is a limit. There is a limit on what can be achieved. And the naval treaties, the Washington Naval Treaty, is a starting point, but it also creates its own problems. It, as we talked about before, that it's one of those things which gets through, often despite the political powers stacked against it, rather than because of those stacked for it. It slips through by the barest of margins. Even in America, it almost goes the same way as the Treaty of Versailles, in terms of ratification by Congress. But it survives. With that all being said, we now have reached the Shameless Book Plug time, so alternate history will begin after this is over. Shameless Book Plug! Oh good lord, when does this video come out? I'm recording like a dozen videos this week, so I have no idea when this video is coming out. I'm honestly lost track. But I hope you enjoy it when it does. I think it's going to be quite... I think it's the 1st of October. I honestly think it's the 1st of October. But thank you for watching this channel. Thank you for watching the videos. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing, helping the channel grow. Thank you for making it everything it is. I don't know if I'll have got to Japan or not. Honestly, at the moment... Yeah, I'm going through the longest house sale known to mankind in this precise time. And it's just racking up more and more money and more interest. Because it started off in May, when the house was first put under offer. And due to various legal things, not to do with our house, or to do with the house which is next beyond the chain, but the house on the chain, and as a house in the chain, the lawyer in there has caused a lot of issues, and it's meant that what started in May has taken to September, and we still haven't sold. And I was supposed to get a chunk of money out of the old house selling, and that was going to help me out with various things and pay off debts, but also give me some extra, which I had been planning to use for various things, including funding Japan. So if we didn't raise enough money in time, it wouldn't matter, it would be okay, I would be able to go to Japan and all these things. And that hasn't happened. But still, whatever has happened is thanks to all your support and your kindness, so thank you. Thank you for making it possible, and hopefully when this video comes out, I'm in Japan trying to find out what Japanese milkshake tastes like. And I'm talking milkshake here, I'm not talking in any euphemism for anything. I don't joke when it comes to milkshake. Mint chocolate milkshakes are important, okay? So are double chocolate milkshakes, and pretty much every other form of large milkshake. Because, you know, if you can't find iron brew, you have to have another substitute, and usually it's a nice milkshake. Especially if I can find a decent burger and fries to go with it. I don't eat... I'm good most of the time. I don't eat a lot of potato and all these things, but, yeah. When I'm treating myself to a burger, there's got to be fries with it. Anyway, let's talk about this fleet that sunk. So, what we have? Well, we have the Flinger, Hindenburg, 2 Flinger class, battle cruisers, Moltke class, Seydlitz class, Von der Tann. So we have 5 battle cruisers, none of them really top of the range now. Not in a world where we're talking about an Admiral class is coming into existence. There are nouns, and even Tiger, let's be honest, can pretty much solo any one of those on her own, if they're on their own. So yeah, they're still good tech though, they're still useful, but who's going to want what? Then we have Baden and Bayern. Now the thing is, those are the 15-inch ships. Realistically, France and Italy both like them, but they more are worried about the other getting them, because if either of the other one gets them, that's a use advantage for them. Britain, they have 15-inch gun battleships, so they'd really like to see what others can do with them, and they also know how capable they are. For America, which is moving on to 16-inch guns, 15-inch battleships are really not that much help. They've got some interesting tech there, but they're not going to fit in their battle line, and this is the point. For America, those ships would be a one-off ship which wouldn't help their battle line, so it's just purely a tech grab. For Britain, those ships could theoretically fit in the battle line, but honestly they don't really want them. When they have one, they look at it and go, no thanks. It just doesn't fit in with the British concept operations, and they have enough 15-inch ships. Only for Italy and France is it valuable enough on its own that they would take it to keep it. So for everyone else involved, it's a tech race, a tech edition. Then we've got the Kaiser class. There are 5 of them. There are 5 of them. That's a useful number of ships. You see, when you look at the Kaiser and the Königs, you could get a full division of a battle squadron, or even a battle squadron in post-World War I world, where it drops from 8 to being 4 ships usually in a squadron of battleships. It's a possibility. Suddenly those become very, very useful for anyone who's going to be fighting over them, and the Italians and French, who are both looking at their capabilities and their force structure, those are going to be the real prizes for them. Baden or Bayern, that's a status symbol. A 4-ship class of battleships? That's something you can sustain operationally. It's not a one-off anymore, it's an entire squadron of battleships. It's useful. It's going to have a measurable effect on your strength. Now, admittedly, those ships aren't exactly the best in the world. Again, they're not the biggest and the best battleships in the world, but they're not bad ships. They're armed with 12-inch guns, okay? So they're not heavily armed, but again, whereas, well, 12-inch gun ships are, as far as the Americans and Brits are concerned, passé, and they're getting rid of them as quickly as they can, for the French and the Italians, they can still fit in them. They can still make sense in their battle line. Alright. And then we have cruisers. We have the Brems and the Brems and the Brummer from the Brummer class. They have the Köln and Dresden from the Köln class. The Frankfurt and the Karlsruhe from the Karlsruhe class. And Emden and Nuremberg from the Königsberg class. None of these are particularly great light cruisers. but for nations which are short on light cruisers, they're useful. So the thing is, for nations which are short on light cruisers, getting the better light cruisers is going to be more useful because you're going to be able to use them for longer. For nations which aren't short on light cruisers, accepting the lesser ones as a might help them with arguing for further up. So this is going to be a lot of horse trading. This whole list is a lot of horse trading and a lot of arguing over it. Now, there's also going to be some other subtleties in here in terms of the power structure and how they reflect things, and also how they feel people have suffered, because let's be honest, everyone at this point feels the French have suffered the most, so they're going to have a slight edge in getting some of the things they want. But if the fleet's around, it's going to be divided up, and that's going to be part of the treaty. So where do things go? Where do things go? Well, there are papers written about it, and there are suggestions about where it would have gone and where it was supposed to go, and there was a lot of work being done, let's be honest. The treaty itself is signed on 20th of June 1919. They are sunk on the 21st of June 1919. There's only a week between the two, so a lot of work had already gone into where the ships were going and who was going to be likely having them. It wasn't finalised as an agreement yet, though, so there is some wiggle room, but there's also, we have an idea. And some of the ships we honestly don't have much of an idea of, but that's mainly because the two big powers are deciding some of their fates between them. And when I say two big powers, I mean Britain and America at this point. There are some of these ships which are being decided by Britain and America because basically they're the deciding votes. The Italians and the French would like it all, but they can't have it all. So in many ways, the Brits and the Americans are deciding votes, and the Brits are more and more concerned with technological acquisition, as are the Americans, than they are necessarily ship acquisition. Okay, if neither of them are looking at these ships and going, you know what, they're going to be a useful addition for a force. They're either denying them from other people, or maintaining them, or using them for them to look as tech assessors. So this is roughly what we get to. And you'll notice I haven't covered in a lot of blues and a lot of American colours. I actually was going to leave the Americans white and black, but that kind of not helped me because it's meant there's some decisions left up. I've worked out what the likely cruiser allocation is. Looking at the notes and things, the likely cruiser allocation would have been this for all 8 cruisers. And the Italians get the Kaiser class, the French get the Koenigs. So the French get the 4 slightly newer ones. Not bad. I didn't give Kaiser to the Italians because they're only going to get 4. And Kaiser looked to be the one which was both best from a technological assessment perspective, worse from an operational perspective from its stats. Now, the Royal Navy is going to go hell for leather to get Baden, as is the British government. But if they take Baden and Bayonne, they potentially miss out on the chance to get both the flingers. And I think they'll want both the flingers. So I think they get both the flingers and probably von der Tann, as well as Baden. And let the Americans have Bayern, Moltke, Seydlitz and Kaiser. Because none of that is really... Okay, this is the thing is, it's going to be interesting tech to the Americans on both sides. An interesting tech to... But it's not going to affect their actual operational strength. Because there are no ships there the Americans actually want to sustain operationally. The only ones the Brits can do that with are them. Now, of course, you could argue, well, what about the Japanese going to get? And this is the problem. See, realistically, the Japanese want something, and they've been in the war longer. The Americans will pay good money to stop them getting stuff, but they get destroyers anyway. So, realistically, something is going to have to go to the Japanese. In that case, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the Kaiser. Send her to the Japanese. The Americans get the Bayern, the British get the Flingers, The Americans get Moltke and Seydlitz, and probably Japan gets von der Tann. Why? Why take less than you are owed? Because it allows you to rule the board. It's one of those old and weird things in diplomacy. If you are owed a lot and you take less, you are able to be magnanimous in how it's gifted. Britain, as a major power the whole way through, could arguably push for just as much as France is asking for. But they won't, because they don't need it. And let's be honest, Japan doesn't really want it either. Getting Kaiser, even if they got a Koenig, that's not really any help to the Japanese Navy. It's not what they want. What they want is the tech. So getting a Kaiser gives them some pretty good tech to look at, gives them a lot to evaluate. Getting von der Tann is also useful from that perspective. It gives them another tech tree to look at, another tech tree to evaluate the ideas of, the thinking of, and plunder shamelessly. The thing is, though, this is going to have a massive amount of repercussions and ongoing consequences, because it's going to increase the number of viable ships every navy has on their allocations. It's also going to mean they're going to be looking at the German technology, they're going to be looking at their own technology, they're going to look at the German designs, they're going to look at their own designs, and they're going to get worried about it. They're going to think their ships aren't good enough because their ships don't have that functioning or that capability or that idea in them. And so it's probably going to push naval construction up the priority list quite dramatically. Quite dramatically. So whilst you also have larger numbers of ships going around, you've suddenly got a more emphasis going on the construction. As I said, I think Bayern goes to the Americans, Baden to the Brits. In return, the Brits can get the Deflingers, the Americans get Moltke and Seydlitz, and Japan gets von der Tann and Kaiser. Because, again, they don't need them. They don't need them. And the British might even give up one of their light cruisers. They might even give up one of the light cruisers because, again, it might be useful to give it to the Japanese. For the Americans, light cruisers are far more important. They don't have a lot of cruisers. Getting the Karlsruhe class vessels will actually be kind of helpful. Because their government doesn't like to build light cruisers. They like to build battleships. Life happens. Governments happen. The world gets more peaceful. It gets more wary. It stays the same. But realistically, this is roughly what we're looking at. Roughly what we're looking at. And the debate is some of the specifics, but realistically, I wouldn't be surprised if I said the Japanese get the Kaiser and von der Tann, the British get the Baden and the two Deflingers, and the Americans get the Bayern, the Moltke, and the Seydlitz. So I've already alluded to the fact it creates problems. I've talked about in other videos the problems that came from the false positives of various testing for the Royal Navy in the interwar years. The testing of the German guns, which led to some of the design and redesign of the 16-inch guns and the shell system which goes into the Nelson and Rodney. Added on to that, you've got later on the whole air power debacle. Well, yeah. This is going to complicate those matters, because for some powers they've now got more ships. And for France and Italy, this is amazing. But this means they now have roughly 10 ships each, which are solid battle line specialists. Maybe more. Depends on what they actually build of their own construction program. And that means they are not going to want to drop below 10. They're not going to want to drop below 10, which also means Japan's going to want to build more. Now, the tech sharing, honestly, actually gets less likely to have false positives the more examples you have. So for the British, if they're testing out the Barden, if they're testing out the De Flinger, the Hindenburg, and they're testing out those guns, they're going to far more quickly find out and go, hang on, this style of gun, it works for the Germans. Does it work for us? Does it work for us? So that might actually help things. For the Americans, having Moltke and Seydlitz and Bayern to look at, maybe they look at Lexington and go, oh frigate, we have really mucked up the pooch. We have really done something bad to the pooch. I don't know. But I do know that's a lot more technology to share around. And these ships were actually the fighting edge of the German fleet, so it's a lot more useful technology as well to share out. Realistically, of course, probably the Helgoland class is still going to end up the same way they did, being sunk as targets mostly, but we'll leave that to one side. We will leave that to one side and their predecessors. But now you have to deal with the consequences of what you have created. And there is going to be a mini naval construction boom. There is, because everyone's going to be looking at their own research, their own technology, and then what they're drawing from looking at the German solution, the German technology. And everyone's going to be worried about what others are going to draw from that technology and what they're going to produce. It's a beautiful conundrum. It's basically going to be, hang on, we know we've got this from this technology, and this has affected our building this way. We don't know how it's going to affect your building. So we better build something to make sure we can counter whatever you build that we don't know is building it. And I'd love to say that doesn't happen in history, but please look at history. You'll find out it happens more often than not. The entire warrior class, in the nicest way, if Gloire had looked like she was going to be in any way more than she was, they have a two-decker version of the warrior design ready to go. And that's what they'd have built. You know, again, if the French had built more than one Gloire, you can guarantee the British would have responded with 3 to 4 warriors of whatever they build, because they have that planning, they have that capacity, because the Gloire itself turns out to be absolutely terrible, is useless. It is a terrible, in terms of operational capability design. Which is one of the reasons why it's forgotten in favour of the Warriors, which are the British response to it. Because the Warriors do look like and are far better ships and far more useful. But the thing is, the Warriors are being built before the Gloire has even hit the water, before anyone even knows what it looks like, based on the image of what it might be. That's what you'll get a lot of in this period. You'll also get the Washington Cherries being completed. The nicest way, the reason I say that is because any naval treaty which is going to start off with the French and the Italians having 10 ships. Okay, think about that. From the British and the American perspective, their scenario was they were allowed 5 for every 2. So then the British and Americans would have 25 ships. The Japanese would have, 15 ships allocated under the traditional Washington Treaty settings? That's a wonderful treaty system, it really is, but it's also not something people are going to necessarily agree with, especially if they think they've got German ships here showing that all the ships are useless, and so they've got to replace them. So you've got to agree some sort of treaty which is going to have construction, and the more complicated you make any potential treaty, the more longer it's going to take to negotiate, and more likely are that at least the G3s, if not the M3s for the British and the Lexingtons and maybe even the Dakotas for the Americans, are going to get finished, and let alone other ships. The Japanese might finish some of theirs. They've got them far enough along in construction. They could well finish some. Amagi might be finished as a battle cruiser. So, yeah. This is going to be a problem. This is going to add a lot of complexity, both in terms of technology and in terms of development. Now, do I think there's no naval treaty? No, because I think they'll probably end up heading that direction anyway, because there's a lot of other factors which are pushing for it. But I think that any naval treaty you get is going to be very different than the Washington Naval Treaty. And it's going to be concluded about 1925, 1926. And that's going to be far enough distance that ships are going to look very different. Very different. And when that becomes the reality you're facing, when it becomes the reality that you're dealing with this technological process, and what did the Germans really show? Well, once they start studying their armour, people are going to realise that the German armour was actually made using not as good a purities of materials as the American and British armour was, which explains some of the issues with it in comparison. But in return, they've had to refine their technique more to make up for those poorer materials. This is the thing, if you have poorer initial ingredients, you have to be far more precise in your technique. Now, admittedly, if you've got the same level of technique going on side, the one with the better ingredients will produce the better quality armour, the better quality steel, the better quality blades, whatever. But that's the reality you're dealing with. The other thing that's going to come in is a lot of examination of German fire control systems and how good they were and how capable they were. There's going to be an argument over that because historically what they found was that they had some option advantages, but there were other advantages in other systems, and so it starts being half a dozen, 1/6 the other. But the more you have access to them, the more you can see them, the more there might be a desire to integrate multiple different systems in terms of fire control, in terms of visual fire control and visual range finding, than traditionally. Traditionally, nations mostly go with one system or the other. But maybe if they see they're looking at the German system, they're going, well, then maybe we have multiple systems. And this is before we get on to the complexity caused by not just Italy and France having those extra ships, having those full squadrons, but what they might do with them. Because it's very different when you're limited to 6 each. Roughly six each, and you have those ships can watch each other. But let's put it this way: to deter 6, you need about 4. You need about 2/3 strength. So that means you've got 2 ships free for the rest of the world, as far as the French are concerned, for their empire, or to be in refit or reserve, and that's problematic. But when you're talking about deterring 10 ships, well, you probably need 5 to 6. You need enough that it's not going to be an easy stomp, especially if they've got other systems with them, which gives you potentially 4 free ships to cover those in refit, those in reserve, those in refit, and those off out in empire. And then you've got the fact the enemy's going to have some ships in reserve, in refit. So you can suddenly think larger numbers give you a capability. The phrase that comes up throughout history is that quantity is a quality all of its own. Quantity gives you options. And options can equate to a capability. A capability to respond to a situation, a capability to deal with a situation, a capability to be involved in a situation. And that's the reality. So, let's talk about roughly 1919 to 1925. So the reality is we're going to be in a world which has a far greater understanding of the lessons of World War I from a naval warfare perspective than we are historically. Why? Because learning a lesson theoretically is one thing. Implementing that lesson, actually building the ships, that's another thing. The ships that are going to get built in the immediate 1920s are going to reflect the individual nations' understanding and what ships are built. It's going to reflect those individual nations' understanding and what they glean from their German counterpart. Now, for myself, I don't think you're probably going to see France and Italy complete that many ships. They've got their ships they have existing. They might do a couple of them. They might even build an aircraft carrier or something each. It's going to depend on what's going on. But I don't think they're going to do too much because, honestly, the German battleships are going to tide them over for quite a while. They're going to give them about 10 years grace, if not a little bit longer, before they have to realistically start worrying about these things. And yes, the person who makes sure that my chair always squeaks is sitting right next to me, because every time I try and put something on this chair, someone, and I'm not going to name names, spends ages licking it all off. Don't they? So, advice for things which are pet friendly, but also they don't like to lick it, that you can put on chairs to stop it squeaking. Always appreciated. Always appreciated. I keep trying, and so far everything I try, he then learns to like, for some reason. Helpful dogs. Anyway, leaving that to one side. The interesting thing for me is with the ships being divided up, and the ships going out, and needs of those ships going out making the world more tense, if America has gone down the same route, and I don't see the stroke not happening and various other things like Andrew Wilson, of not joining the League of Nations, that has probably made things more problematic for the Americans in the longer term. This is why I don't think there would actually be a naval treaty for a few more years. America not joining the League of Nations, the nations feeling individually stronger, having the looking at the technology and feeling both individually stronger in terms of number of ships at their disposal, but also weaker in terms of looking at technology and going, hang on, there's this gap between ours and what the Germans are producing and what other people are going to learn from the German technology and all this sort of stuff. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting few years. Now, I think you still do end up eventually with some sort of treaty, but it's not going to be based, it's not going to be as close to the Washington model as possibly something which allows more construction. I could see something being along the lines of, okay, you're allowed to construct this many ships, but again, if France and Italy are going to agree to maintain parity, and are going to be limiting themselves to 10, 12 ships, which they might have by this point. They might well have 12 ships in total each. That's going to create problems, okay? Japan is not going to accept parity with France and Italy. They're not. No amount of browbeating is going to, and in the 1920s there isn't the appetite for a war versus Japan. They haven't done the things which they will do later to make it able to pull the same amount of pressure to them as historically is happening in the run-up to World War II. So that's a problem. So let's say you go, well, we're going to accept France and Italy having the same ratio. They've got 10 to 12. Let's go for worst case scenario. They have 12. And they're accepting the ratio of, we will accept 2.4 for every 5 you have. Now, 2.4 for every 5 you have is 25 for the British and the Americans each. Are the Japanese going to accept 15 to the British and American 25? Or are they going to demand probably they're going to demand 3.4. Some region of 3.4. Something a little bit over a third, not a full 70%. And that would allow them to have 17. Now, if Japan's on 17, the US Navy's allowed 25, the Royal Navies are allowed 25 between them, which might well mean things like Australia gets to keep their battlecruiser, because let's be honest, if you're allowed 25 ships, why take Australia's battlecruiser off it? At that point, it just saves the bill being on the UK government. That's just a wonderful thing. We're allowed 25, parity with the Americans. Okay. Means you want to have 8 capital ships operating in the Indian Ocean area, 8 in the Mediterranean, and 9 probably back in the UK. That's probably what the British will be doing along with this. The Americans, well, 25 ships and 25 they want to keep. That's pretty much all the standards, but there's also a lot of things which are coming after them. And that's going to be interesting. Do they how's the government have to paid to finish off the things coming after them? Have they frozen them based on the understanding of the German and the German ships and their knowledge of them? Have they paused it? And also, how has the impact of the Cherries under their construction? Because the Cherries being built, that's going to be 18-inch gun battleships coming into service. That's 16-inch battle cruisers. And again, in a nicest way, do you worry so much about dropping the G3s down to 16-inch guns in a world where there are so many more capital ships going around? Or do you leave them with the 16.5-inch guns as originally designed and accept the fact that they aren't going to be able to fit in as many dry docks? Or maybe you're going to have to work on expanding the dry docks. This is going to complicate the world. Okay? There are decisions we take as rote in history which don't make the same amount of sense and actually could be slightly different in a world where that fleet is not scuttled. And that's going to have an impact. As said, my view is that you probably end up with some sort of treaty being agreed about 1925. But that's quite a long way down the road. Let's be honest, if we consider the G3 class, okay? We start off with the G3s. They were all ordered and had started construction in October 1921. Now, if we go by the same timetable and take roughly 3 years, they're going to all be in service by 1924-25. Well before any treaty negotiations probably start. They're not going to be at the plausible point. And the very next year was when they were planning on starting the battleships, the M3s, and again, they are mostly going to be built by the time this starts. And whatever comes after them might be what becomes known as the new Cherries. There's also, where does the negotiation take place? Does it take place in Washington or London? In a mid-1920s world, with the world as it is, and with the politics going the way they had done, things might have changed. There's also going to be an interesting effect of what happens to the Lexingtons after the Americans get a look at Seydlitz and Moltke. Are they happy and content to leave them as economics warfare / cruiser killers? Or do they want to change that? Do they want to change that after looking at them? And why, again, did the treaties delay? Well, because people won't necessarily feel the need for a treaty. Because, okay, one of the reasons why the French and the Italians go into it is because, well, they don't want to keep building to compete and have numbers, but now they have a lot more ships without having to build them. They've got the competition. They don't need to build it. They've got an excuse to lower down the pace of construction without having to go do the face-saving thing of a treaty. They've got another reason to lower that construction speed, because we've already got these ships. Why do we need more? What more do we need? It changes the world a lot. And I'd love to give you certainties about this, but there are going to be all sorts of things which change, because the next thing you have is to deal with Germany and the German problem, because for Germany, especially for the Navy, the scuttling of the fleet was a last act of defiance, a last act of honour, which was something which was widely lauded, and was considered a great thing of their national pride and status. Yet if it's not done, that's going to be something which is going to be brought about as a dishonour. It's going to be... Think about this. Think about the first time a French-badged German origin dreadnought visits Denmark or the Netherlands. Doesn't even visit Germany. Visits their neighbours. Or makes a port call in Poland, going into the Baltic. Then you've got, of course, well, the threat the Americans are going to feel after looking at their ships and learning from them, and then thinking about what the Japanese are learning from their German ships and how that's affecting German design and construction. Because that was always the big worry, especially for the British when it came to these ships, was how much of a fusion would come about from them. And a fusion is always stronger. A fusion is always stronger. The world would be a very different mess than it was historically. And please note, I use the word mess. The early 1920s would be filled with construction, with study. And at certain points, someone, once people felt they'd actually understood things, would probably go, okay, we need to stop this before it gets out of hand. We've reassured ourselves enough, we've got enough people sated with their fears, we can actually do a pause. And I think you probably end up with a London Treaty. I think instead of it being a Washington Treaty, I think it ends up being a London Treaty. And I think you end up with a treaty based on a 20-year construction cycle, with you allowed to construct within your ratios over those 20 years, and you're allowed to keep you're allowed to keep a certain number of over-age ships. So you say capital ships have a 20-year life. You're allowed to build this many over 20 years. Let's say you're British American. You're allowed to build 20. But you're allowed to make a 25% over age. So you're allowed to keep 25% of that force. So you're allowed to keep a further 5 for another 5 years. Okay, that gives the British and Americans their 25. You work the same out down for the forces below it. The Japanese, well, I don't think they're going to accept 15. That's going to put them far too close to whatever the French and the Italian 12s, 10, 12. If the French and Italians got 10, then maybe the Japanese accept 15. Possibly they'd try for 16. If the French and Italians have 12, there is no way they accept less than 17 or 18. There just isn't. And that's going to be a very different force than you're historically dealing with, because these ratios are not just going to affect capital ships, because you have to consider the other thing you're going to have building this time period is aircraft carriers. The British, the Japanese, the Americans all were constructing their own carriers, all were thinking it through. What you probably find is they're constructing their own carrier forces. The British had plans for some really weird plans. They had plans for up to 30 carriers in various different drafts. The Americans had plans for the carriers. Everyone seems to have plans. This is going to change the world. Any London Treaty is going to be very different in this scenario in 1925 than the Washington Treaty or the London Naval Treaties which followed it. Because you're dealing in a world which has some of the Washington Cherries built, which has a serious amount of extra firepower wandering around in terms of the German ship, that German high seas fleet, which had been portioned out. And this is going to have an effect on the global economy. It's going to have an effect on the global politics. So the world is going to be very, very different. It's going to be very, very different. I do think you're also going to have any treaty negotiators going to be that much further from World War One. And the thing is, nothing fades as fast as the horror of war. Not from the leaders' minds. It fades quickly. And that's going to again change the context of any negotiation. With that being said, I want you to think about this. In this kind of scenario, we know pretty much what the first two generations of ships are going to come after. You know, Britain, we know it's going to be the G3s and M3s. They're pretty much going to. I don't see that changing. We know the Americans, the Dakotas, the Lexingtons, those sort of things. What's going to be the class which comes after them? I need to think through the major powers who get these ships and what I think about. I want to think what's going to be the class that comes after the ships we know are coming. The third ones. The ones ordered not in 1920, 21 or 22, but the ones ordered in 1923. What are they going to look like? What differences could there be in this world? And how's that going to affect? Because those ships are going to be the standards which define any negotiated treaty in 25, 26. So what are they going to look like? What's it going to be? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And what have we got coming up? Well, this is going to come out before the 7th for the Battle of Lepanto, but yeah, Alliance of Command. It's going to be a fun one. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. And if you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and yeah, it's fun to have all these questions coming through Patreon, etc. Thank you.